to terminate him for engaging in brief private prayer because he can be seen by others, well, that's not just wrong, it's unlawful.
Faith on the field, how one high school football coach's prayers with players wound up in the Supreme Court. Expert analysis from one of our nation's leading legal minds. As we celebrate Black History Month, we'll tell you about a Catholic fraternal group with deep roots in U.S. history. We speak to the Supreme Knight of the Knights of Peter Claver about their works of community service.
Father, we need to do this. I'm worried about my grandchildren.
Helping Catholic grandparents share their faith with their grandchildren. We'll tell you about one diocese's evangelization program to bring faith to the next generation. And tales of love and marriage from Turin, Italy, the birthplace of St. Valentine. EWTN News In Depth starts now.
I just want to be able to have the free speech, just like everybody else in America.
Prayer on the football field. At long last, a high school football coach will have his day in the Supreme Court after being fired for practicing his religion on the 50-yard line. The High Court, with its new conservative majority, agreed to hear an appeal of Kennedy versus Bremerton School District, addressing the free exercise of religion for a government employee. This is the second time in 3 years the case makes it up to the court, when 4 conservative justices in the minority, Alito, Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and Thomas, said the case might justify review in the future. That time has now come. Reporter Mark Irons explains.
I was simply removed from my job for praying on the 50-yard line alone by myself.
Former public high school football coach Joe Kennedy will finally have his case heard at the Supreme Court.
It's been a long battle.
After the 2015 football season, following 7 previous years of coaching, Kennedy lost his job at Bremerton High School in Washington State. The school upset with his years-long tradition of taking a knee and praying on the 50-yard line after games. Now, Kennedy hopes for a favorable ruling from the Supreme Court that could get him back on the sidelines with his team. But the Bremerton School District, represented by Americans United for Separation of Church and State, argues no child attending public school should have to pray to play school sports. This case is about protecting impressionable students who felt pressured by their coach to participate repeatedly in public prayer. Americans United told EWTN News In Depth they would be unavailable to follow up with an interview. But Kennedy says you can ask the players themselves.
Not a one of them has ever felt pressured.
Over the years, some of his players or players from the other team joined him at the 50-yard line, but he says the school still took issue when he prayed silently alone.
And the whole idea of somebody losing their job just for praying, it still boggles my mind.
The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals has sided with the Bremerton School District, ruling that the school could forbid Kennedy's public prayers to respect the separation of church and state. Last year, a judge on the appellate court said Kennedy initially offered silent private prayers while on the job, but added an increasingly public and audible element to his prayers over the next approximately 7 years. Kennedy's lawyer says keeping prayer repressed is unconstitutional.
To say that prayer in public is wrong and needs to be hidden from view, that actually sends a message of hostility towards religion that would be teaching the kids on the field and anybody else who cared to see it that religion in public is wrong. The First Amendment says quite the opposite, as a matter of fact.
If the Ninth Circuit ruling isn't overturned by the Supreme Court, First Liberty Institute argues a dangerous precedent could be set and claims public school employees could be fired for things like praying before meals.
Or they could fire the teacher who's wearing a yarmulke in the hallways of the school, or a crucifix, or a hijab. All those things are outward displays of religion that are visible to every student in the facility.
The Catholic Church teaches all people have a right to religious freedom. The Vatican II document Dignitatis Humanae, a declaration on religious freedom, states, "This freedom means that all men are to be immune from coercion on the part of individuals or of social groups and of any human power." It continues, "The social nature of man, however, itself requires that he should give external expression to his internal acts of religion, that he should share with others in matters religious." Coach Kennedy spent years preparing his players for football battle, but this former Marine says he's now fighting for the Constitution he once vowed to protect.
Just want to be able to have the free speech, just like everybody else in America.
Mark Irons, EWTN News In Depth.
For more on whether school teachers give up their rights because they're government employees, we turn to the attorney who will be arguing the case for Coach Kennedy in front of the Supreme Court. Former Solicitor General Paul Clement, who's argued more than 100 Supreme Court cases, joins us on the record. Paul, thank you so much for taking the time to come and chat with us about this case. It was denied and then brought back up again. What changed to make the court take up Coach Kennedy's case?
Well, two things changed in the intervening couple of years. One is that we got a more fully developed record in the case. And so now there's no question that Coach Kennedy was fired because he wanted to engage in prayers on the 50-yard line after the game. At earlier stages of the case, there was some question as to whether maybe the school had multiple reasons for firing him. But now that's been clarified and the issue is squarely presented. The other thing that changed is that the Ninth Circuit, the lower court here, added an additional rationale to its decision that I think in many respects is even more problematic. So I think that may have helped us get the court's attention this time around.
So fired for praying, that sounds horrible. At issue here, though, is whether public prayer can be performed by a government employee. In this case, a coach at a public school. Why is this a problem?
Well, it's a problem for Coach Kennedy, obviously, because he was fired for engaging in these prayers after the game had ended. And I think what makes this issue interesting and important is there is a difference between a teacher or a coach leading the team in prayer, which I think does implicate a number of Supreme Court cases that say that that kind of school prayer is impermissible, and what's at issue here, which is really the ability of a coach or a teacher to engage in their own private religious observance, whether that's a prayer at the end of the game, whether that's crossing yourself before eating a meal in the lunchroom. And I think what's so important about this case is it really does hopefully help the court establish the principle that as a teacher or a coach, you don't give up your individual rights to engage in religious exercise just because you enter the school grounds.
That's helpful, Paul, but then how is this different from holding a Bible study in school or saying the words under God in the Pledge of Allegiance? I realize those are very different examples, but can you help us draw some lines?
Sure. Well, in some respects, I don't think it's that different. And I think the fact that the Supreme Court has already said that those kind of practices are permissible are a big part of the reason why we're hopeful that the Supreme Court will reverse the decision below and vindicate Coach Kennedy's rights here. Because the court has already held that, this idea that there has to be a complete wall of separation, that there can be no religious acknowledgments in the school setting at all, the court's already rejected that argument. They've already said that you can have prayer groups use school buildings after school hours for Bible studies. The court's already said that the Pledge of Allegiance, including under God, is permissible. So the court just hasn't embraced the notion that I think the other side has embraced in this case, that there has to be some kind of strict wall of separation so that the school sends a message that really is one of hostility to religion.
Paul, you were talking about the record in this case and developing the record. What is the role that school boards now are playing in this discrimination of religious teachers, students? Is there something that they're doing, particularly in this case, they obviously did something, that we should be looking out for?
Well, here's the thing. School boards perceive themselves to be in a difficult position because they fear that if they allow a coach or a teacher to engage in any kind of religious activity, they will get sued by the ACLU or Americans United for Separation of Church and State or some of these other groups. And the reality is, based on repeated Supreme Court precedents, that the school boards actually should not be worried about that. What they should be worried about is suppressing free speech and suppressing religious exercise, because that is clearly protected by the Constitution. So hopefully the message that will emerge from this case is that school boards are actually not between a rock and a hard place. And what they need to do is to recognize that when an individual teacher or an individual coach wants to engage in their own private religious expression, that's something that the school boards can allow and indeed must allow. And doing so doesn't create any establishment clause problems or other problems that they should be worried about.
Let's dig into that a tiny bit more. There's this phrase that people like to throw around, the separation of church and state, which they use as kind of a cudgel against religion, to scrub all of religion from the public square. Can you tell us why that's wrong?
It's wrong because there are really two clauses of the Constitution that speak to religious liberty, and a third clause of the Constitution that's equally important here, which is the free speech clause of the First Amendment. And there's this perception that the way to understand the religion clauses, and particularly the Establishment Clause, is this idea of a wall of separation between church and state. But the Supreme Court's already made clear multiple times that that's just a metaphor and not an apt description of what the Constitution actually provides. And the Constitution is much more protective of religious liberty than that metaphor might suggest. And these clauses don't work really in opposition to each other. What they really provide for is there's a big difference between what the government does. If the government wants to have an official prayer, well, that's a problem. That implicates the Establishment Clause. But if an individual wants to say a prayer, that doesn't implicate the Establishment Clause, even if the government allows it to happen. And indeed, if the government tries to suppress that, it violates the First Amendment protection on free speech, and it violates the First Amendment protection on free exercise of religion. Well, so again, I think the important thing is these clauses are not really in opposition to each other. And as long as what you have is something you recognize as private religious expression, then the government should allow it to go forward.
And you're a great advocate of those First Amendment rights. When can we expect to see you before the court and to hear oral argument?
So I believe this case will be scheduled for oral argument in April, probably one of the last cases the court hears this term. So I expect the argument to be in late April, and we expect a decision by the end of the term. So that means the end of June.
Well, it looks like you'll be arguing before this composition of the court and not the composition that is currently being debated in the Senate. Thank you so much, Paul.
My pleasure. Great to be with you.
Great to be with you, too. EWTN News In Depth is just getting started. There's much more ahead. Stay right there.
Grandpa and Grandma's story, why they're devout Catholics and why they embrace the faith and why Jesus and his church are so important to them.
Evangelizing your grandchildren. 3 things grandparents can implement in their family faith leadership. We'll talk to a priest spearheading a new program coming up a little later. And next, recognizing Black History Month with a look at an influential Catholic organization that's worked for more than 100 years to build up fellowship and community. Welcome back to EWTN News In Depth. February is a time that our nation lifts up Black Americans, celebrating the contributions they've made in building our country through science, engineering, art, music, sports, and innovation. In honor of Black History Month, we highlight a Black organization within the Catholic Church. The Knights of Peter Claver. It's the largest historically African-American Catholic lay organization in the United States. It provides a place for fraternity, leadership, faith formation, and acts of service to the community. The order was founded in 1909 in Mobile, Alabama, by 4 priests. Named in honor of St. Peter Claver, the patron saint of African Americans, the enslaved, and African missions. The Jesuit missionary from Spain ministered to slaves in the colonies in the early 1600s, providing food, medicine, and more for more than 40 years. Over this time, he baptized and instructed an estimated 300,000 slaves. I'm joined now by James Ellis, Supreme Knight of the Knights of Peter Claver in Houston, to get a deeper understanding of this Catholic organization's rich history and current activities. James, it's great to have you here. The Knights of Peter Claver have a history dating back to the early 1900s. Why is that history so significant to you and the order as Black Americans, but more important, as Catholics?
Well, it's extremely important because the 1600s is when slavery actually started. It was the Middle Passage, and our slaves from our ancestors traveling from Africa, stopping in the Middle Passage in the 1600s, and through 400 years later here in America. And in the 1600s, this great patron saint of ours, St. Peter Claver, as you described earlier, was a great leader for us. He nourished us, he evangelized us. And throughout the years now, for 112 years here in the United States, we've remained consistent to that purpose, Catholicism.
It's a beautiful purpose. Absolutely. What special role then do the Knights have in the global church as a beacon of light?
So we are one of 24 or so international Catholic organizations, Knights of recognized by the Pope, 24 of us, and our role is to support the church, to support the Holy See, to support our individual churches, and to come up with strategies to carry out certain goals and objectives we have as Catholic men, and in our case, women and children.
Is there something that the Holy Father has said to encourage you, something in particular that Pope Francis has shared with the global community?
I think the one thing that almost every day he comes up with something that will just ignite you, will light you up with the Holy Spirit. But the one thing that he says is that every one of us has a right to the church, to be church people, to be welcome into the church, and we have a right to live a life or to experience a life in the Catholic Church that are free of certain things. One in particular is racism, and that does ignite me.
And some orders are experiencing a surge in membership right now. Is this the case for the Knights?
Knights of Peter Claver right now, since 2000, we have been a victim of COVID, and we've not been able to get out. We've not been able to recruit as we normally did, but we remain consistent. We have 17,000 members, plus or minus, and we've maintained that number through the COVID experience, which for us has been losing about 500 of our members to death since the COVID. So we've remained consistent, which means that we have grown to make up for that loss in membership through death.
That's a terrible tragedy, having so many COVID losses. I'm sorry to hear that. Unlike some orders, though, the Knights of Peter Claver do have a female counterpart. I find that really interesting, the Ladies Auxiliary. How do they complement the work of the Knights?
Absolutely. They're probably a microcosm of the church. Women are oftentimes more present in the church than men. And then the same thing in our order, they really complement us. They motivate us to carry out certain functions. They join us in planning strategies. They are probably 50% more ladies than there are men in the organization. And so we work together to come up and execute our strategy. Our goals, both our goals, are to become the organization of first choice for every Catholic. And so we work hard to ensure that we are constantly working toward that end.
That's a beautiful mission. The Knights and the Ladies do really admirable work in the community, including blood drives, food banks, and work with new mothers. I love that. Why is this taking action in your communities around the country so essential to your mission?
I mean, that is the one thing that's remained consistent. Here in the last 4 or 5 years, we've added new things to our strategies. For example, we've added our social justice efforts, but we have consistently, over the 112 years, been strong in our communities, looking for individual things to do in our churches, and blood drives, feeding the homeless has always been there and remains there. But as we've taken on 5 areas of social justice to broaden our scope and to broaden our service in the greater community, we've taken on racism. We've taken on human trafficking that affects our communities in disproportionate ways. We've taken on domestic violence, which equally affects our communities in different ways. We've also taken on criminal justice, and finally, the dignity of Black lives. And all of that has continued to motivate us to be even more active around not only the feeding of the homeless, which is a dignity thing, feeding people, serving people, blood drives, but it's to that greater cause.
James, you talked about an issue. You're knitting all of these together beautifully. You talked about the issue of racism. How does your community work help with that? How does your community help to counter that great scourge?
Well, we've done a couple of things and continue to do a couple of things. One is to look for partners in our community that are doing like causes. George Floyd's death in May of 2020, we reached out to every one of the ordinary bishops in the United States, and I personally wrote them a letter asking them to partner with us to find ways to attack this problem of racism. Is that we couldn't sit around any longer and treat it with the ways that we've done in the past. We had to be more aggressive. So we've done that. We have webinars at least twice a year. We've got one coming up February 19th in Black History Month on racism, where we'll have speakers come in and talk about the racism in the Catholic Church, racism in America. And we've done about 4 of those in the last 2 years. And they've been well attended, sometimes having almost 4,000 people attend those webinars.
Well, it's beautiful to see that you are not just educating Catholics and the global community about this issue, but also engaging in corporal works of mercy and service. You're a leader and someone to model. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
To learn more about the Knights of Peter Claver, head over to their website to discover more about their history, read more about their works in the community, and to find local chapters. We turn our attention next to religious freedom and human rights in concerns in China.
Superlative.
The Winter Olympics in Beijing wind down to the finish. With the focus on the athletes, how effective were protests and diplomatic boycotts targeting human rights abuses in China? We get reaction from a leading Uyghur American next. USA skier Megan Nick takes home the bronze medal in women's aerials in the 2022 Beijing Winter Olympics. The world is watching as this Olympic Games draws to a close, with nations competing for bragging rights in winter sports. But despite the cheers, there's been an international outrage on where the Games were held as more information becomes available about the persecution, torture, and imprisonment of Uyghur Muslims in China.
Boycott, boycott! Beijing Olympic! Boycott, boycott! Beijing Olympic!
Protests were held in cities across the globe, calling for nations to boycott the Olympics and dubbing the Games the Genocide Games. There were some countries, including the U.S., that had diplomatic boycotts of the Games. But was that enough? What else needs to happen to secure basic human rights for all Chinese citizens? Uyghur American Nuri Turkel joins us now for his insights. He's an attorney and the vice chair of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. Nuri, it's great to have you here with us. Thank you. As images from the labor camps...
Thank you very much for having me on.
As images from the labor camps become more prominent, how has the conversation changed since the opening ceremony?
The Chinese government, as well as the IOC, underestimated the power of consumers. One great indication that we've seen, the significant drop in the viewership, as reported in the case of NBC. We're talking about nearly 50% drop. So when the general public speaks out, it matters. This is the way that you put pressure on corporate America, the businesses that have been complicit in the ongoing genocide. And I can't imagine that this genocide Olympic would have taken place if it was not for the support that the IOC received or CCP received from the corporate sponsors, namely Visa, Coca-Cola, Nike, Procter & Gamble, Omega. So these are the companies that have been supporting this genocide and previous, these are the companies that have been supporting this Olympics and previous Olympics. Let me just mention something really quick about the strange business practices of IOC, which is their affinity a strange affinity to dictatorial regimes, authoritarian figures throughout the history. Starting from 1936, we know what happened to 6 million Jews and rest of the Europe after that Berlin Olympics. And we know what happened after the Tokyo Olympics and then the Rome Olympics. And then fast forward in 2008, those of us who advocate religious freedom and human rights around the world, and particularly in China, told the world that this is a wrong occasion for glorifying this communist regime, and no one listened. And then Sochi Games happened. During the 2008, Putin invaded Georgia, and shortly after the Sochi in 2012, Putin invaded Crimea. And now we're in a very precarious situation that this kind of games will not only encourage and normalize bad behaviors, bad actors, repressive regime, but also this kind of fanfare will embolden them. And the diplomatic boycott was at least that the international community, the free world, the Western societies, the governments could do. But we could have done better. We could have just removed this Olympic to another country, right. Relocate to another country that does not commit a genocide.
And there's so much more to be done to protect the Uyghur Muslims and help secure their rights. Tell us a little bit more about what you've seen with these genocide Olympics. Have there been attacks or censorship? I know some athletes were given instructions to avoid incensing the Chinese government. Was this necessary?
You know, it's easy for me to say I told you so, but it's not really helpful. But we have cautioned the United States government. We have actually cautioned the athletes that they need to have a really careful look at the circumstances, because as we know now, the Chinese not only told the athletes that they need to be mindful of potential consequences for their speaking out on politically sensitive, quote unquote, sensitive issues. Our FBI, the US government, alerted the athletes that they should not take their mobile devices to China, risking those devices to be hacked, monitored. So that's the reality. And this is the same country that developed and exported surveillance technology around the world. This is the regime trying to normalize religious persecution or committing genocide in a broad daylight was something normal. And look at the responses, which is quite disappointing. Only 8 governments and parliaments in the Western liberal democracies have responded, at least fulfilled part of their treaty obligation under the Genocide Convention. So the Chinese have calculated carefully, and they did expect there will not be an international cry. They did expect that the business community continue to be in their pocket and doing the bidding of this communist regime. And they did also expect that some feckless leaders around the world who could be impactful will stay silent or show up just like the way that Antonio Guterres did at the opening ceremony.
Nuri, then what can we expect with the Olympics wrapping up? What happens next for advocacy for justice for the Uyghur community?
The status quo is untenable. I call the international community, U.S. Congress, to hold or put in place additional legal tools to hold IOC and these corporate sponsors to account. This cannot happen again. This genocide Olympics actually could have been a good tool for international community to pressure the Chinese to stop the genocide. The opposite happened.
A missed opportunity.
Yeah, it's a missed opportunity. Because to the Chinese government, 2 things are very important. One, their global image. The other is their economic interest. The U.S. government and bipartisan nature have been responding to the Chinese by hitting their economic interest with more than 100 punitive sanctions, 2 pieces of legislation in the last 2-3 years. But without the cooperation from the business community, we will not be able to do this alone. Without the cooperation from our traditional allies and partners, we will not be able to handle this problem alone. So I think first thing first, we should go after IOC, specifically the president of IOC, who is, it's just like, getaway driver situation. The Chinese, let's say the Chinese are committing bank robbery, and IOC is in the driver's seat. So this should not let go. We need to hold the IOC president and the organization itself and corporate sponsors to account. This is not America that you and I know. The American companies does not sponsor genocide and not supposed to sponsor genocide. So this is wrong in all aspects, and we should not let this go. And we should hold them to account.
And Nuri, you're holding them to account in your new book, No Escape. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
I wrote a book with the title No Escape because even though I'm a free person in the United States and I'm a proud U.S. citizen, and now I'm a U.S. official, and I'm a practicing lawyer, I have the American dream in many ways that I can be very happy and proud of. But at the same time, I'm not that free because I as you know, that I've been sanctioned by the communist regime last December. And I cannot go and visit my parents or cannot get my parents out of China. But comparing to the others, my situation is less concerning because we know that our fellow Americans have family members in the concentration camp. In order to illustrate that tragic situation, I give my book a title, No Escape, because none of us were able to escape from this communist regime, even though we are free people, including myself here in the United States and some countries around the world, free countries around the world.
Well, Nuri, so, we look forward to having you back to discuss your book and to tell us all about your story. Thank you so much. By the numbers, new statistics from the Vatican show the number of Catholics worldwide is on the rise. We'll have details of where the church is growing most rapidly. And the theme is revealed for the church's second annual World Day for Grandparents and the Elderly. That, plus grandparents connecting to grandchildren about leading a religious life. We'll be right back. News about growth in numbers within the Catholic Church tops the Week in Review. New statistics from the Vatican show the number of Catholics worldwide rose by 16 million people in 2020. The Vatican Central Office of Church Statistics compiled the information, which indicates there are about 1.36 billion Catholics, making up more than 17% of the total world population. The Church grew most rapidly in Africa and Asia, and more modestly in Europe. Almost half of the world's Catholics live in the Americas, with the larger percentage of them living in South America. However, there were fewer priests to minister to all those parishioners. In Europe, there are about 1,700 Catholics per priest, about 2,000 Catholics per priest in the Americas, and more than 5,000 per priest in Africa, where growth is more robust. A call for justice answered, according to some of the surviving family members of those killed in the Sandy Hook elementary school shooting in 2012. After years of legal battles, the families of 9 of the 20 shooting victims agreed to a $73 million settlement against Remington, the maker of the rifle used in the mass shooting.
Our son Ben didn't behave irresponsibly on December 14th. He went to school. And now he's gone. And we're here because we want to make sure that another father and another mother don't have to stand here Sunday.
Today is a day of accountability for an industry that has thus far enjoyed operating with immunity and impunity. And for this, I am grateful.
Remington, which made the AR-15 style gun used in the massacre at the Connecticut school, also agreed to allow families to release its internal documents, showing how it marketed the weapons to young males with product placement inside violent video games. The gunman who used the rifle to kill the first graders and educators was a 20-year-old male with a history of mental illness. Remington filed for bankruptcy in 2020, weighed down by lawsuits. 4 insurers for the company agreed to pay the full amount of coverage available. A lawyer for the plaintiffs said their hope is that the large settlement will serve as a wake-up call to the gun industry and its financial backers. A settlement of unknown amount in the explosive sexual abuse case involving Britain's Prince Andrew. In a case that threatened to overshadow Queen Elizabeth's Platinum Jubilee celebrations this summer, Prince Andrew agreed to settle a civil lawsuit in the United States accusing him of sex abuse of a minor. The legal maneuver came less than a month before he was scheduled to be deposed under oath about his involvement 20 years ago with a woman who was 17 years old at the time. Over the years, the prince had repeatedly denied knowing Virginia Giuffre, but in the settlement, without admitting guilt, he acknowledged she had been a victim of sex trafficking and agreed to donate an undisclosed sum to her charity, which supports victims' rights. Giuffre says she was introduced to Prince Andrew through his close association with convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein, who is believed to have exploited hundreds, if not thousands, of young victims by trafficking them to men in his elite and powerful social circle.
Il tema di quest'anno è la forza della cura.
Earlier this month, Pope Francis called human trafficking an open wound in the world. In a video message, he urged the faithful to join in the fight to end all forms of slavery and exploitation. The United Nations says women and girls account for 3/4 of all victims. The Pope said many societies around the globe continue to deny women the same dignity and rights afforded to men. In old age, they will still bear fruit, from the book of Psalms 92:15. This week, Pope Francis announced the theme of this year's World Day for Grandparents and the Elderly. The Dicastery for Laity, Family, and Life, which organizes the day, says the Pope's theme is an invitation to reconsider and value grandparents and the elderly, who are too often kept on the margins of families, civil, and ecclesial communities. World Day for Grandparents and the Elderly will be held on July 24th, coinciding with the feasts of the Blessed Virgin Mary's parents and Jesus' grandparents, Saints Anne and Joachim. This is the second year of this celebration. The Pope's letter for the first year of World Day for Grandparents and the Elderly inspired one priest to launch a new program to highlight the role of grandparents and seniors in the life of the Church. The Saints Anne and Joachim workshops are aimed at helping grandparents evangelize their grandchildren by giving them the tools they need to pass on the faith. The unique program helps strengthen the roles grandparents have in the lives of their grandchildren. I recently spoke to Father Damien Ference, Vicar for Evangelization for the Diocese of Cleveland and Professor of Philosophy at St. Borromeo's Seminary, about what led him to initiate these workshops. Father Damien, this is such a beautiful initiative. What inspired you to start a program like this?
Oh, thanks, Montse. Thanks for having me on. And what inspired me was Pope Francis's letter to grandparents entitled, "I Am With You Always." Last summer, I had just come back from Rome, and one of the pastors in our diocese asked if I would take confessions and the Vigil Mass. And in prepping my homily, I think it was the weekend of Anna and Joachim's feast. And the Holy Father had just published this letter to grandparents and calling them to be evangelizers and to embrace the vocation, even in retirement, of passing on the gospel. And so I preached on it at that Vigil Mass. And the Vigil Mass had a lot of older folks, seniors and grandparents. And I got such wonderful feedback after, like, "Father, we need to do this. I'm worried about my grandchildren." And so I went back downtown and talked to my team and said, "What do y'all think of doing something like an Anna and Joachim workshop?" And they said, "Yeah, let's do it." Talked to the bishop. He said, "Do it." And so that's how it came about.
And from that response, what do you think people need? What is it that's that disconnect between young and old, the way that Pope Francis describes it?
Yeah, so many of our seniors and so many of our grandparents were taught to live the faith very well, and they do, and they're very devout. But one thing they haven't been taught or trained or formed to do is to pass it on in not just example, but in word, and to share their own witness. And so a lot of times they think, well, I think my grandkids will pick up that I'm a daily mass goer, that I have a devout life and pray the rosary. But maybe what they haven't been taught to do just yet is to say, here's my story. This is where I was in life. This is when I came to a deeper love of Jesus and his church. And this is how my faith has helped me through. And to be explicit in passing on the faith, and not simply trusting that their kids will pick up their rhythms, because maybe they need to be told and shared the story, grandpa and grandma's story, why they're devout Catholics and why they embrace the faith and why Jesus and his church are so important to them.
So the focus a lot of the time is on the children, what the grandparents can do for the children. But do you think there's something unique in this call to grandparents that then gives them purpose and counters the throwaway culture?
Oh, yes. In fact, I've got the document before me, and the Holy Father says a few things in here are great. He says, there is no retirement age from the work of proclaiming the gospel and handing down the traditions to your grandchildren. You have a renewed vocation. And so often, the world, once you get beyond retirement, will, say, well, let's just focus on the young. But the Holy Father's letter is a reminder that grandparents, that seniors still have tremendous amount of work to do, even if they're not able to do the kind of work they once did in their younger age. They're still called to be missionary disciples and to bring the gospel to others and to remind their grandparents that every human life has value, from conception to natural death. Grandparents, teenagers, those in their 20s and 30s, everybody's important. Everybody matters.
Absolutely, and we heard Pope Francis talk about that recently. So then what are the 3 major takeaways you hope these grandparents will be able to implement in their leadership roles within the family?
Well, I would say it's what the Holy Father has put out in his document. He says, number one, it's to preserve our roots, that the grandparents are holding on to the tradition, and it means that we have to stay rooted. Right? That's where our word radical comes from. So stay rooted in our Catholic faith in Christ. Second, to be able to pass on the faith to the younger generation, especially, I'm 46, so my generation didn't have the benefit of what I would call catechesis and evangelization the way that we're doing them today. There was a lot of there's a lot of flux after the Second Vatican Council. And then third, I would say, as the Holy Father says, it's to care for our little ones, to make sure that we're going out and making sure that our younger brothers and sisters in the faith are being taken care of.
It's so beautiful to see you take on the mantle of this encouragement that Pope Francis has given us and this call to engage everyone in the new evangelization. Thank you so much, Father Damien.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
The Saints Anne and Joachim Grandparents Workshops in the Diocese of Cleveland start in March. EWTN News In Depth will be covering one of those workshops and will bring you that story in the coming weeks. You can check out the Diocese of Cleveland website for more information on registering if you're in that area. Coming up next week on EWTN News In Depth, a behind-the-scenes look at the Shroud of Turin exhibit set to open at the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C. I spoke with researcher Russ Brialt, who has been studying the Shroud for more than 30 years.
As a gospel written on linen, it speaks every language, has no need for translation, and it speaks to every level. Now, what I mean by that is a child is able to say, look, mommy, look, daddy, it's Jesus. A teenager can look at it and say, wow, this is really cool. But then an academic and an intellectual can take the theology and the science and the history and go as deep as they want to go. It speaks to every level and speaks to every language.
We'll hear more about the secrets of the Shroud and give you a look at this incredible exhibit right from your own living room. Be sure to tune in next Friday at 8 for our in-depth coverage.
We are in love.
Couples gather in Italy's City of Lovers. Inspired by St. Valentine, they ask for blessings and a happy married life. We're a witness to their journey when EWTN News In Depth returns. Love is in the air in Turin, Italy. That's the birthplace of St. Valentine, where pilgrims venerate him every February 14th, asking for a blessing as they enter into marriage. Our column Flynn traveled to Turin, where he talked to visitors about their hopes, their dreams, and their faith journeys.
I'm in the town of Terni in the Umbria region in the center of Italy, where over 1,700 years ago, a boy called Valentinus was born, who would leave such a legacy after his death that his name became synonymous with love forevermore. Everywhere you go throughout Terni, love is in the air.
Valentine is beautiful for me and for my wife. I love.
St. Valentine is beautiful in all over the world. Because it's the saint of this city, so to us it's very important.
Amore, love. I mean, he was the first marriage between two Christians, and it happened in Terni, and so that's why there is this festivity. We are in love.
Under the twinkling streetlights and the glowing love hearts, local chocolatiers and artisan cheese and bread makers set out their stalls, enticing those who pass, and everyone is in good form.
I love St. Valentine, really, because people buy chocolates.
But what is most important to the people of Tourney is what's located on the edge of town, the Basilica of St. Valentino. In the basilica, under the altar, are the relics of Valentinus, or Valentine, the 3rd century bishop who lived here in Tourney.
In the Passion that describes him, at the beginning of the 6th century, we recognize the figure as an evangelizer driven from Tourney to Rome to evangelize the last pagan fringe of the city, especially the pagan aristocratic class of the city.
Across the weekend festival, his relics are processed through the town, and this year the basilica unveiled new paintings of the saint. Valentinus became known for his passionate evangelization and would marry young lovers in the Christian tradition. However, this did not win him the favor of Emperor Claudius II, ruler of the Roman Empire at the time.
Valentine starts to become a problem for the rulers because of his preaching the gospel message, which undermines the last resilient fringe of paganism, which then heavily influenced the political and cultural balance of the city.
When he refused to stop marrying Christian couples, he was arrested and brought to Rome. There, legend says that he performed a miracle on the daughter of one of his jailers. She was a blind girl called Julia, and Valentinus restored her sight. Upon witnessing this, the family converted to Christianity, and when the emperor heard this, he ordered the execution of Valentinus.
And that is why, at night, he is taken to Via Flaminia and was killed in secret.
Today at the Basilica, a tradition is being kept alive as young, soon-to-be married couples gather to receive a special blessing from the bishop in front of the relics of St. Valentine.
To celebrate our love, and we came from our city to get these events together.
They process into the church, many holding white roses, symbolizing their pure love for each other and their commitment to a Christian marriage.
I think that's serenity, and it makes confidence in our intentions and reinforces our wishes, because what is the power of man compared to the power of the Almighty?
Inside the Basilica, the bishop reminds them of the significance of committing to a Christian marriage and the loyalty they should show to each other and to God.
This is the importance of Valentine's Day, a mix of authentic love of God and the giving of one's life. And it is also important because we have to understand the profound value of what love is, not just simply a vague feeling that exists today and passes tomorrow.
Wonderful family and children and a healthy life together.
Peace and love.
One of the legends of St. Valentine is that right before he was executed, he wrote a note to the girl Julia, who had been blind, and signed it, "Your Valentinus, your Valentine," making it the first Valentine's card sent in history.
From the city of Tourney, all of humanity should hear the message of love, and it should be embraced by the whole world.
The young couples leave the Basilica of St. Valentine after receiving that special blessing from the bishop. And now they will go forward in life as soon-to-be newly married couples, bringing with them in their hearts the legends and the stories and the values of that 3rd century saint, St. Valentine. In Tourney, Italy, Colm Flynn, EWTN News In Depth.
Colm always gives us context to those great moments like St. Valentine's Day. And that does it for this edition of EWTN News In Depth. I'm Montse Alvarado. We hope to see you back again next week, same time, as we continue the discussion about all things important in our Catholic lives. See you then.